Yeah. So speaking of pain and how it relates to hiking, what are the most common injuries or issues that you see coming up for people?
Well, knees are the most common one, I think, and that's just the nature of knees because they're stuck between the ankle and the hip, and a lot of the time the knees aren't the problem. Like the knees are just they're always the culprit that where the pain arises, but often the problem is not actually in the knee. Then the knee's a fairly simple joint. It's like it's just a hinge joint. It can't rotate. Well, it can, but it doesn't do it a lot. The hip, on the other hand, is a very complex joint, and the foot is even more complex. So knees are often where the problems arise, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the knee is the problem, and it's often the ankle or the hip. And if you want to go another level deeper, then it's probably to do with the ability for you to stabilize your own body using your diaphragm. So it could be a breathing issue. And the more that I start to understand about these things, the more that I'm inclined to think, well, yeah, the way that the ribs are interacting with the diaphragm is having an effect on the pelvis, and that's having an effect on the knee. And the longer I stay in this game, and the more I learn, the more I tend to look towards the center of the body. And if we can stabilize and center our breathing, and we can fully create support within our abdominal cavity when we breathe, like each breath, we do 22,000 breaths a day. So if we can make a 1% improvement on that, then it's likely going to have an impact on the rest of our body, because the diaphragm is the largest stabilizing muscle in the body. So if we're not getting good amplitude, and if our zone of apposition, it's the space within the rib cage, if that's very wide, we actually want a closer zone where the ribs are sort of closer together and closer in towards the spine. And that creates intra-abdominal pressure, which stabilizes our midsection. And so we can do all of the work to, the feet are a big issue as well because they're so complex, but we can do all the work with the hips and the shoulders and everything and run up against these problems continuously. And if we're not looking at breathing as the fundamental pattern that it is stability wise, then like that's where I would recommend people look into, because if they've continually hit these walls where they're just like, oh, I'm not getting anywhere with this stuff, like I'm doing all this mobility and all these drills and nothing's changing, then I would be looking at the breathing. And so like the last year and a half of my life has just been diving deeper and deeper and deeper on this. And it's been really interesting. I guess the hard thing is to get people to understand
Well,
how
let's make
breathing could
this
potentially work.
let's make this a little more like personal then, because I think
Mm,
that's really it's really fascinating. Because I mean, at first I was thinking, all right, let's talk about ankles, let's talk about hips,
mm,
but let's come back to those and talk about breathing here for a second, because I've had a few issues come through my life. Right, I've had plantar fasciitis, I've had knee pain, but the one that's been the most common has been back pain. And for
mm,
years that like really plagued me. And then I learned how to stretch like my psoas muscle. That was like a big trigger point and issue for me. And so I learned that. And then I was able to kind of like stave it off. Like if I did all my stretches, then
mm,
I'd keep it at bay. And then a couple years back, I started to get into trail running quite a lot. And that seemed to actually help my back, I feel like. Like I had some initial pain for like the first month. And then it almost seemed like the motion of movement and getting that movement in more on a daily basis, I think helped me a bit. And so then I dropped some weight. I dropped, 20 pounds or so from running and was in a good spot. And then just this last March, my back, I just woke up one morning and my back was just like out in it, and I couldn't train. I couldn't do anything for a week. And I was really frustrated by it because I'm like, usually I know these triggers that start to lead into some of this stuff. And the biggest thing I could really think about was I was dealing with with a higher stress load leading up to that. Which I've also linked to my back pain at times, but I've never had a link to it, right? Like I've never been able to like, well, when I'm stressed, this is why my back can be more susceptible and stuff like that. I'm wondering if maybe there's a connection with what you're talking about and it affecting my core, which then affects my back, like you've mentioned.
I'm sure there is. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't. I don't know if I can give you a clear answer on it, but let's talk about, I guess, the nervous system, which I like to think of as the governing body that is really in control of everything that happens in your body, and including that in the mind. So you went through this period of time where you were a little bit sort of jacked up on your nervous system under a lot of stress, and that's not only in the mind, like the body holds that tension. And so you may have been storing certain amounts of tension in other parts of the body, and then maybe you had a kind of a crappy night's sleep where you weren't in a great position, and you lifted yourself out of bed, and then boom, the lower back starts firing up. So when it comes to the nervous system, this is inherently tied to breathing, because as far as I know, the only way to influence our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, is to do controlled breathing to manipulate that. So there's the stability aspect that I talked about before, which is a bit more of a mechanical thing. So that's really about utilizing the diaphragm to stabilize the body. But then there's breathing as a method of influencing the nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system. And so this is basically your fight or flight response, or fight, flight, or freeze, versus your rest and digest. So we can utilize breathing as a way to purposefully put us up into fight or flight, so that we have more so I guess we're more mobile in our autonomic nervous system, so we can force our way up, which means we can up-regulate when we choose, and then we can also choose to down-regulate. So it's more flexibility in the state that the nervous system is in, as a, like, when we're going about our daily lives, when there's no threat. But then that threat it's not necessarily like a tiger. That threat can be just stress from work, you know. So then if we're spiking up and we're being up-regulated into a sympathetic state where we're, you know, fight, flight, or freeze, that's certainly going to impact our physical body.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me, and this might have been in that, I know this is a book you've read, the Breathe book by James Nestor, but I feel like I've seen a stat somewhere that breathing is one of the only ways to like almost immediately reduce stress levels in the body, like doing a controlled breathing pattern or like a, you know, some people, I hate to say the word meditation because I think people get the wrong like knowledge of that, but a lot of meditation can just be breath work, right? But if I'm remembering right, it's one of the quickest and only ways to really just reduce stress almost immediately in the body is by focusing on breath and doing maybe a box pattern breathing technique or something, right?
Yeah. You can drink a whole bunch of beers and smoke some weed, maybe. But then you pay for that later. It comes back to bite you.
Right. That's true.
So yeah, there's ways. I mean, this is the modern human. We cope with stuff like this.